All right, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 21st DEM I Wonder webinar. DEM has so many services, offerings, programs, and hidden gems that we want to share with all of you. So we are excited to take just a few minutes each week to highlight these features in our weekly webinar. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many exercises have been postponed or canceled. The Utah Division of Emergency Management is hosting this weekly webinar series aimed at providing local emergency managers with relevant content and opportunities to enhance their capabilities. Webinars are live for Q&A and are recorded for later viewing on the DEM website and YouTube channel. Most of these webinars are seminars or workshops with a hands-on portion which will allow emergency managers to become oriented to a DEM process or test a DEM product. Our schedule today will be as follows. We will start with our ground rules and etiquette. Next, we'll have a brief presentation by Angelia Crowther and Jamie Huff on I wonder what the relationship is between floodplain management and emergency management. Following the presentation, there will be a hands-on portion with participants, where participants will be encouraged to test out the product or process that was presented. Following the hands-on portion of our program, the presenter will be available for a Q&A session. Following the Q&A, we will close with a short message about upcoming webinars. The ground rules today are fairly simple. Please mute your line while the presenters are presenting. If you have a question, you may type it in the group chat or unmute at the appropriate time to ask your question. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future review. Thank you all for the attendance today. With that, I will turn the time over to Jamie and Angela.
Thanks, Jeff. If you wouldn't mind, stop presenting. There you go. Okay. Let's see. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see familiar faces and names. Working previously as I was a liaison for DEM, I worked with a lot of you, and I'm excited to see a lot of familiar names and faces. And then now as the new floodplain manager, it's been really cool to also meet a lot of new faces and names. So I'm super excited to be here. And I think if it's okay, I will introduce Jamie. Jamie, if you want to take just a minute and introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jamie Huff. I am the Risk Map Program Manager. I work really closely with Angela. So a lot of times if you see her, you'll see me not far behind, or the other way around. We have a great floodplain program here at the state, and we're very excited to present today. So thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jamie. With that, I think we'll just go ahead and go into my presentation. Do you all see, Jamie, do you see my slideshow? No, not yet, because I have to hit share.
There it is.
Okay, sweet. So yeah, we kind of wanted to discuss floodplain management and emergency management. Being new to the floodplain manager position, I'm excited to learn more about this myself. So I feel coming into it and presenting, I don't know if I have enough that I want to share, but I'm excited to at least to share, some of the experiences I've had with emergency management and also now with floodplain management. So kind of excited for that. And if I can get to my screen. Okay. So why are you here? We're here to understand floodplain management and emergency management, create and foster relationships. Collaborating and partnership building is very important, as we all know, in emergency management. And we're just going to briefly touch a little bit on the National Flood Insurance Program and understand and know how to use flood mapping. So here are some statistics on flash flooding and fatalities in Utah. You can see that we have 29 between 2010 and 2018, and this does not include the 2 deaths that occurred in 2020 in Little Wild Horse Slot Canyon in Emery County. So we are showing around 31 fatalities. Flash flooding is actually number 2 ranking on natural disasters and fatalities, and lightning being number 1. So here are a whole bunch of laws, codes, legislation feel free to write this down. I know that I believe Training and Exercise will be posting this to their website as well and sharing this presentation, so you can go back and actually capture this. But this is basically, this legislation, codes and laws are why we do what we do and what we follow within floodplain management, either at all levels, at federal, state, and local levels. So what is floodplain management? Basically, and I see Scott on this meeting today. I see your face, and I don't know, Scott, if you see yourself front and center there. This is this is Hilldale's flash flooding event, and it was a perfect example of floodplain management and emergency management all coming together during such a big event. But basically, floodplain management is a community-based effort to prevent or reduce the risk of flooding, resulting in a more resilient community. Multiple groups with a stake in protecting their communities from flooding carrying out floodplain management functions, including zoning, building codes, enforcement, education, and other tasks in floodplain management. It also provides affordable flood insurance to the community. So the community's role in floodplain management, basically, if a community has adopted NFIP standards, they are going to adopt a local floodplain ordinance, and they're also going to designate a floodplain administrator. That administrator is going to ensure that regulations and higher standards are encouraged, they're enforced. They're going to be providing technical assistance. They're going to be issuing floodplain development permits, inspecting development to ensure compliance, maintain records of floodplain development within the special flood hazard area. And they're also going to assist in preparation and revision of floodplain maps. And then last but not least, they're going to help remedy any violations that are occurring within that special flood hazard area, so that that community will avoid suspension within the National Flood Insurance Program. So NFIP, it's a voluntary program based on a mutual agreement between the federal government and local community. In exchange for adopting and enforcing floodplain management regulations, federally backed flood insurance that is made available to property owners throughout the community. Yeah, and I just wanted to touch that, you know, it's also there to help protect lives and property and reduce losses throughout active floodplain management. So it's a great program. And then there are this is the three-legged stool. And as you can see, there are three things that are really holding up that NFIP program. And that's flood hazard identification, mapping, which is why I work very closely with Jamie in all of her activities in mapping. And then flood mitigation, you know, that flood administrator is working with making sure those regulations are being met through the building codes, the IBC, the IRC codes, and the ASCE 24. And then also, you know, those grants that are available to help with that mitigation funding and projects and to help reduce that flood risk and save lives. And then also the flood insurance, which is there, which helps with property owners when they're participating and they're able to get affordable insurance. So floodplain management and disasters, 75% of declared disasters that FEMA supports are flood related. This picture is from Carbon County, which I actually was part of this event. So it's very near and dear to my heart, but it's very important. So floodplain management and emergency management, you know, you're working together. You're wanting to make sure that you're all in that EOC together. You're working towards the same goal, not only to, you know, help with recovery and disaster assistance and ensuring that, you know, you can help save lives for the next event. So it's very important, those two partnerships. And then participating communities and homeowners, if they are participating in that insurance program, they're eligible for disaster assistance, which helps, you know, recover quicker and respond quicker. There's less suffering and a brighter path forward. And then just a quick quote, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail, by Benjamin Franklin. So that's kind of what we all do in emergency management. We're constantly preparing for that next big disaster and trying to mitigate and reduce a lot of that suffering for the next event that comes along. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the time over to Jamie to talk about flood risk mapping.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll go to the next slide, and Angela kind of touched on a lot of, you know, what community responsibilities are. But really, you know, a lot of the floodplain management is really going to be with your floodplain managers, who's typically in either planning department, your city engineer, possibly public works I've seen, or maybe even city recorders or whatnot. They have a lot of those responsibilities, you know. But as emergency managers, we know there's a whole other piece of floodplain management that isn't just building codes and insurance. And we really, like Angela said, we really do want to plan for that event. And so emergency managers have, you know, kind of a shared responsibility with our floodplain managers. And, you know, obviously you guys are responding to your disaster events, no matter what it is. We're focusing on flood today. But we want to make sure that, you know, whatever information that we can give you is accurate and up to date. You also have that, you know, operations and response planning piece. A lot of you as emergency managers also help develop your mitigation plans. So having, you know, or knowing that, you know, where your flood risks are a key piece to that as well. A lot of you also manage your mitigation grants, or any grants. Doesn't matter which grants, but that can mitigate flooding. But we need your help in doing more risk outreach. We have a lot of folks that are underestimating our flood risk here in Utah. And not only that, as you probably saw in some recent reports from the new census, is that we are the #1 growing state. And a lot of folks are coming from out of state and are very unaware of our risks. Again, not only just flood, but all of them. But, you know, we really need your help with your emergency managers and your floodplain managers to start educating more about what that risk is. And there's just so much more that you do that you know, we can all, you know, help provide that. So next slide. Actually, I'll just kind of touch on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to use some of the information that you have available to you as an emergency manager. Next slide. I did present on an I Wonder webinar back in November. Here's the link to that. If you're ever wondering how flood maps are created and developed, go check out that meeting there that explains in detail on how those are created. But again, feel free to ask me any questions if you have anything that comes up. Next slide. If you don't know what your flood maps look like, I encourage you again to reach out to your floodplain manager. They are going to be your subject matter expert for floodplains. You have boots on the ground, you know your area just as well as, you know, your planners or your floodplain managers. But they also house your floodplain mapping. And I do know that there is a lot of outdated flood maps out in Utah. I am working on that as fast as I can, but know that they are out there and they are available. Flood risk is not static and does change over time. I want to kind of throw that out there too, is, you know, what can show as a floodplain today may not be tomorrow, or maybe there might be an increase in an area, you know, next week, next year, you know, what have you. So there is information out there, and we're working as hard as we can to get more out there, you know, every day. So keep a lookout for new and updated information, hopefully coming to a community near you. But what we produce is we produce the flood insurance rate maps and a study basically the report on how the maps were made. We also have GIS data. So if your community has a digital map, they are available digitally, and the data is available digitally from your floodplain manager. And then we also have non-regulatory products, which are some additional data sets that can be used to help you communicate risk to property owners in your community. Next slide. I'm just going to quickly touch on where to find all of these products. We have several places, and again, you can access some of these links later after the presentation, but we have several places. The main one I wanted to point to is your FEMA Map Service Center. And for those that do not have digital mapping yet, because again, it's hopefully coming to a community near you, this is where you would access your paper information, is the FEMA Map Service Center for now. Eventually, once we get everything digital, it'll be on the National Flood Hazard Layer. But your local community should have a copy of these maps. And if you need the modeling, which is generally used for engineers that are restudying, you can access them from FEMA here. Next slide. And then one last kind of plug here is not all of our flood risk is mapped. That is an understatement, actually. Only about 10% of our state is mapped with their flood risk. And want to be careful of that when we're starting to talk about risk to property owners. Just because that creek in your backyard isn't mapped right now doesn't mean that it couldn't potentially produce a flood event for a specific property owner or not. So again, we're working on how to get some of this information to you, especially in the central and southern Utah communities. We're working really heavily right now on getting that information to you. But you don't need to live near water to experience flooding. Scott, raise your hand. You can say that to St. George. That's 2019, or excuse me, last year in August, they had a pretty decent sized flood event, and not all of them lived next to a creek or next to a water feature. So you don't have to live near water. And then low risk does not equal no risk. We get these thunderstorms and water travels downhill no matter where that thunderstorm starts. So another kind of fact there. And another one is that 70% of flooding has been located outside of those high risk areas. And that is largely because none of our flood risk is mapped, but our maps can be outdated, which again, we're working on as we speak. And so just wanted to kind of point that out, that, what you see on a map today might not be accurate and may need to get updated, and we're working on that. So next slide. I'm going to run through a couple things real quick, a couple displays of some mapping products that we can produce, and kind of the increasing risk that you can see through our floodplain mapping products. So here's a series. What you would show today as a 10% annual chance flood, which is the 10-year flood, which is basically your garden variety everyday event. This is what it would display. And then the second piece, next slide, is your 4% annual chance flood, which is your 25-year flood, if what people call it. We can produce products that can show you areas where these recurrence interval floods occur. So this would be your 25-year or 4% annual chance flood. Next slide is your 2% annual chance flood, which is largely equated to the 50-year flood. And then the next one is your 1% annual chance flood, which is what the regulatory flood insurance requirements are associated with, plus building requirements. And then we also produce a product on the 0.2%, which is the next slide, which is your 500-year flooding event. So we can produce all of these products for your communities, and some communities have these already, where it shows exactly, what type of event is going to cause damage in specific areas. So as an emergency manager, you would want to know that. So say you are thinking about building your EOC in one of those, red areas, which is the 0.2%, maybe that's not such a good idea. but then, you know, communicating that risk to someone that basically lives next to the river that has a 1%, or excuse me, a 10% annual chance event basically means they're going to get water a lot. We can help communicate that information. So next slide. So I wanted to go over a couple ideas that you as an emergency manager can utilize some of this information that your floodplain manager may have. Now what's on this slide is land use planning and capital improvements. You may be involved in some of these discussions, you may not. This is mainly for, you know, sometimes elected officials or your planning departments, but know that a lot of our information can be used to facilitate the discussion on your land use planning and capital improvements. It can help review your annexations in future areas. So say you're wanting to annex in an area that has a high flood risk zone. You'll have to think about, you know, what those land use decisions are going to be in the future. And then obviously your capital comprehensive plans and land use plans. We want to make sure that all of this information goes in there. The next slide. And we also want you, or hoping that you can use this information for more public outreach. Like I said, you know, we're getting a lot of folks coming in that are out of state that may not be aware of what our exact flood risk is. And here's some ideas, and all of our products are available that we hope that you put them anywhere you can possibly reach out to your community, whether it be, you know, your websites, provide training itself on flood risk, mailers and fact sheets and things like that. We have a plethora of documents and information to help educate the public on risks. But really what I have noticed, and I've experienced in recent past, if you have historic photos like the one Angela shared, or if you have any historic ones, maybe black and white photos, those are so telling in helping communicate the story and communicate the risk to the community. Yeah, there might have been some mitigation since then, you know, and obviously development since then, but it really helps to kind of manage expectations and manage you know, the perception of what flood risk is for our communities here. So next slide. So here's some more ideas on how to use some of our information in your operations planning. Obviously, you know, we want to make sure any critical facility and infrastructure plans includes our risk information, especially evacuation planning, because obviously if there's an event, you're going to need to get people out and get people out fast. And if it's flooded and underwater, that's probably not the place that you're going to be allowing traffic to evacuate some of these areas. I know our recovery team has been really hard at work trying to develop those recovery plans, and you probably have too at your community level. We want to make sure that, you know, any shelters, any temporary housing, any distribution sites, and anything that is going to store temporary like debris or even have a distribution, we want to make sure that those aren't included in a mapped floodplain area, because if it does flood, that's another event that you have to work with and deal with. So evacuation planning, oil response planning, crisis management, anything like that, we want to make sure that you have the flood risk information for you to include in all of those plans. Next slide. Here's some ways that you can use it. So I showed the progression of flood risk data that we can develop. You can use what we call depth grids, which is those different colors of information, and to see, you know, have a scenario-based planning and exercise event. Highlight, you know, those communities, those areas that need flood risk education. Maybe those folks that live next to the river need a little bit more and more often. And then obviously we can assist in looking at these recovery planning efforts and preparedness planning efforts to see, you know, what we're doing is not going to impact the floodplain or impact you during your response if there is a flood event. Next slide. And a lot of the information that we have available can express, well, how bad is it going to be? How bad is the flood event going to be? If we use that road, can we use that road during a flood event that's predicted? How about a hospital or an airport? Again, shelters, a lot of good questions that this flood data can help you answer. Next slide. You also work on your mitigation plans. This is extremely valuable information when you are working on those plans. It locates where your flood risk is and can help you perform those risk assessments and determine that severity of risk. Are those critical facilities in the floodplain? And can any of these areas be mitigated? Now, some of the mitigation projects might focus a lot on culvert improvements or education and outreach, which is all great, but maybe you have a critical facility inside of a flood risk area that you'd like to see mitigated, either elevated, relocated, things like that. You can start planning for that now. And then identify really any mitigation project. Is a large portion of your town in an alluvial fan? Would a debris basin, make sense? Things like that. So a lot of this information can help you identify some mitigation opportunities as well. Next slide. And there is a portion, there is a loss estimation tool, HAZUS, which many of you may know about. There is a flood section of that. So our data can help fold into your HAZUS information. A lot of the HAZUS data is what they call out of the box flood risk information. But if you have more detailed information, you can certainly use that in your HAZUS modeling, which is a loss estimation tool, both infrastructure and potential life as well. So keep that in mind as well. As if you get detailed studies, we can start folding those into those HAZUS analyses as well for loss estimation projections. Next slide. And then again, helps you identify where those priority areas are for mitigation efforts and, what kind of activities need to be done in specific areas and how many that are impacting. Because certainly all of this, if you work on mitigation plans and projects, this looks like your benefit cost analysis, doesn't it? So a lot of our data can be used in that as well. Okay, next slide. And kind of talked about this a little bit. There's different various grants that are available for mitigation. Flood is certainly an eligible mitigation activity. So I encourage you to kind of look at your mitigation plans and see if there are any different types of mitigation projects that can be done. Anything, upsizing culverts, bridge deck elevations, relocating houses, elevating houses, you name it. Our mitigation section has quite a healthy list of eligible activities that you can seek out information from. Next slide. Okay, so this is our example. What I'm hoping, that's kind of that portion is the end of our presentation, if you will. So right now I kind of open it up for discussion. So this is going to take place instead of asking you just specific questions and having you give me one or two answers, I'm hoping we can have a discussion on this particular example that we have. So feel free to chime in. Feel free to open up your mics, take yourselves off mute, and kind of have a discussion here. So we have this example of what we're calling a nursing home. You can call it anything you want. You can call it some kind of critical facility, whether it be your EOC, a hospital, what have you, but whatever is important to you in your community. So we're calling this a nursing home for argument's sake today. And we want to have a discussion on if you saw basically new maps coming out showing that, next slide, actually, we'll show you here. As an emergency manager, this is the same exact property. Our nursing home or critical facility that we're calling a nursing home is kind of sandwiched between possible evacuation routes and the floodplain. As an emergency manager, what are some questions right now that come to mind when you see a map like this? Just chime in, anybody.
So I'm just
call
going
on
to go ahead
people.
and ask a question. I would want to know, as a floodplain manager, is that facility insured so that they're eligible for disaster assistance? I know that doesn't have anything to do with evacuations, but just throwing it out there.
Yep. Anybody else?
Jamie, I'd want to know if this was in my area, their evacuation plans. What do they have in place in order to get those patients out? If it's a nursing home, like you said, do they have
Right.
the proper resources to get them out? How critical are their patients, that are there? Right. And so, I mean, there's higher end nursing homes where people can get out on their own and stuff, and they're just there, for the rest of their life, or just that's where they choose to be. Or is it more like, critical care patients that need to be evacuated as well? And what plans are put in place to get them out in this event?
Right. Yep. Anyone else have any ideas?
They're all nervous.
I know. Come on. It's just
if you have a question, you can place it in the chat as well.
Yeah, feel free to chime in. There we go. Here's one. Is there a backup facility? There we go. Here, we're getting some details here. To transfer patients, and is it located in the special flood hazard area? Yes. What routes have been established as evacuation routes, and will anyone need to be evacuated to? That's a perfect question. If this, within the circle is flooded, how, is there another way that we're going to be evacuating people? Maybe road isn't the appropriate way because it's going to be underwater, possibly. Are there any other ways? So some questions that come to mind to me and might be relevant to your community as well is, how old is the virus data? Does it need to be updated to show what either the risk is today? Because maybe this was developed, 20, 30 years ago, possibly. Or, is it more up to date, accurate? Maybe it was only 5 years ago that it was developed. So maybe it's a little more accurate than our older mapping. Is the facility at risk, or is the staff aware of what this risk is? And do they have, like everyone had mentioned, procedures in place to do any potential evacuation or response? Is it flood proofed in any way? Is it elevated? What really is the risk to flooding for this particular structure? And then, yeah.
In the chat, Kimberly asked, do they have an alert system? And then Doug asked debris, he mentioned debris and utility sewer disruption or damage as well.
Exactly. Critical infrastructure that feeds into this is certainly a great question too. And then, yeah, Kimberly, perfect. Do they have an alert system? Is there a communication plan? Do you as an emergency manager have to communicate with some of these facilities as well? Like say it's a hospital or, something that, do you get the information first and you communicate it? How is that communication going to happen to say a flood is imminent and they need to take action? How would that work?
Hey, I have another twist for you, Jamie.
Yeah.
What if they have to shelter in place? Do they have the resources in order to shelter in place and they cannot evacuate?
Exactly. That's a perfect example as well. Do they, yeah. Yep. Does the facility have a plan if an event were to occur? Is there a system in place to alert emergency contacts for residents or employees, or not just the residents, but their family members? Maybe there's, depending on the capabilities and the patients in there, maybe they can't communicate directly with their own family members. So, how is that? What's it called? not reconstitution. Oh, it's escaping me, but how is that reunification effort going to happen potentially if there is an event? You know, just things like that to kind of keep you aware of, you know, what would happen or what is likely, you know, during a flood event in some of these areas. Now I'm going to throw another twist to everybody. Let's go to the next slide. Now, as an emergency manager, say, you know, that field was open, you know, 10 years ago when the evacuation plans were built and developed and all of this planning coordination was done. What happens when now you see, you know, development occurring in and around this facility? Yes, we want the communities to grow. We want them to build safely in these areas. But as an emergency manager now, what are now some questions that you would start asking yourself if you started seeing growth in and around an area that has these types of plannings in place? Any thoughts? Shy group today. Have you thought about this at your own community? This is a very possible scenario in a lot of communities, and you know, have you started thinking about it? You know, how would it impact your emergency planning? You know, now you maybe have had an evacuation plan in place for that one particular facility, but if you now start seeing growth adjacent to it, you know, now you're going to have more people and more people evacuating. So how does that impact your evacuation planning process?
There's a question in chat by Doug again. Community development. What did you do with the FEMA floodplain map?
That is a good question too. But you know, I'm hoping that, you know, you guys can have that conversation. You know, your floodplain manager is one of your subject matter experts for flood risk. So yeah, I'm hoping that they are also brought into, you know, your response planning efforts, because maybe they can do something to mitigate the risk or more accurately portray what the flood risk is, so you know what it is as well. Exactly. So they should be a part of your mitigation planning efforts to talk about that flood risk section. Maybe it's just one portion of the mitigation plan that they can help you with. But yeah, they should be included in your planning process. And then again, you know, are you aware of any mitigation actions that can be taken to reduce the risk here too? And then I have a big question for you. Do you have any funding set aside for mitigation at your local community? I've been hearing, you know, less and less that there is, and maybe that's a discussion that can be brought up at the local level, you know, with your leadership and really talk about, it doesn't have to be much, you know, just, and maybe it can roll over year after year if you don't have a project, you know, identified or in mind right now. But maybe there's a problem area that you see with a flood risk that you can start having those conversations about funding set aside. And, you know, I've heard some communities can use development fees to help fund some of these. I've heard of flood, it's escaping me, I'm sorry. Flood groups, you know, forming to flood control districts forming, and maybe that's, you know, not appropriate for your community or your area, and that's okay. But, you know that there is that, you know, capability there too, you know, to start looking at flood control districts and things like that to make sure everyone's building right. Because we don't want you to respond to something that could be preventable. And then again, if there's something that we can take away now, coordinate with your planning public works folks. They are invaluable in not just, you know, building and development, but also providing some support on the floodplain management side, and vice versa. maybe you're out and about and you see something that maybe your floodplain manager might want to know about. I know one of you on this call has done that already. And I'm not going to call you out, but I know, someone was out there and saw something, some building and development happening that said, maybe we should take another look at this, and contacted their floodplain manager. So things like that. That's just some helpful examples of how we can bridge the gap and make connections and support to our floodplain managers and emergency managers. So I think with that is mostly what I had. Any other thoughts, Angela? No? Shaking her head.
Sorry, no, I'm good. No, that was excellent. Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, so there's a ton of resources out there. If you need some resources, or your floodplain manager, we really are looking to help educate a little bit more on our flood risk here in our state. And I know right now we are in a drought. Totally understand, get it. But that does not mean we will not, stop having our big thunderstorms that are causing a lot of our most recent flood events. So just know that we do still have a flood risk, even though we're in a drought. It's probably going to be more localized and but high intensity. So keep a lookout for those, and I'm hoping everyone stays safe. So yep, use your flood data to help you in your efforts as an emergency manager. So I think that's all I had.
Hey, Jamie.
There's our team.
I want to add, sorry, I had somebody in my office. There was a lot of noise. But if emergency managers aren't sure who their floodplain administrators are, please feel free to reach out to me. I have a database of that information and can help you out in any way that I can. So, but yeah, no, thanks, Jamie. You did an awesome job. And thanks, Jeff and Tracy and Kimmy, for allowing us to present on this platform. So it's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hey, do we have any other questions or comments for these two before we end the session? Perfect. Okay, with that being said, thank you, Angela and Jamie, for your presentation today. As a reminder, this webinar and all other webinars in this series will be available on the DEM website at dem.utah.gov/exercise, or now at dem.utah.gov/iwonder. Our webinar next week will be I Wonder How to Conduct a News Interview, presented by Wade Matthews. If you have any I Wonder topic suggestions, please reach out to tbodley@utah.gov to have your topic added to our calendar. We're always excited to help you explore and get to know all that DEM can offer the emergency management community. So until next time, keep wondering.